1 year before the unprecedented storm, IEM brought experts together to imagine the unimaginable. A hurricane so powerful it would overwhelm levees, flood New Orleans, and displace hundreds of thousands of people. This was IEM's Hurricane Pam exercise. A warning, a blueprint. When Katrina struck, those lessons learned through exercise not only saved lives during the real hurricane, but also shaped the nation's response and changed how our nation prepares for disasters for decades to come. This is the story of Pam, and how it defined everything that came after, putting survivors first in response efforts.
My relationship with the hurricane striking Southeast Louisiana actually goes back to the early 1980s. About the first job that I had in emergency management was as program manager for the Southeast Louisiana Hurricane Evacuation Study, where I worked with 9 parishes, including the city of New Orleans. And we did all the simulation modeling, working with the National Hurricane Center, sociological modeling on what people might do in the case of a hurricane, and eventually evacuation modeling to see how long it would take to evacuate people. So really, the origin of IEM was the origin of this disaster that might strike Louisiana. It was the impetus for me to actually start IEM because I saw that there were consequential problems to be solved, and perhaps I would be part of solving them. Fast forward about 20 years later, in 2004, we won a contract for catastrophic planning for the nation. And the first project out the gate was a project in Louisiana. We created a hypothetical hurricane called Hurricane Pam. And as the president and CEO of the company, I was involved with our team led by Brad Tiffy in delivering the products that we delivered for FEMA and for the state of Louisiana under the banner of Hurricane Pam.
Innovative emergency management, the Baton Rouge consulting firm hired to build the computer models that brought Pam to life, deliberately avoided special effects. Rather, the company sought to turn disaster planning on its head by creating a believable scenario and then inviting the participants to grapple with its effects. What unfolded was something quite different from the usual war game exercise that FEMA and the Pentagon had always used to stage their drills. War games are far more scripted, high-concept exercises often played on very realistic mock sets. But the low-tech Pam generated tremendous passion, perhaps because it had such a real-life application.
Had a great model. One thing I remember, one of the few things I remember about Pam, in the modeling, we model everything for consequences like search and rescue, medical, patient, and everything but death. We were within 1% and 2% in estimates in Pam that happened in Katrina.
We did this work in partnership with the state of Louisiana. And Colonel Mike Brown, who was the emergency management director for the state of Louisiana, was the customer that we were serving, even though the contract was with FEMA. And he was overwhelmed when we had the first Hurricane Pam exercise. There were 300 people from SBA, Army Corps of Engineers, state of Louisiana, FEMA, the state of Mississippi. They were just, all the stakeholders were there at the table at that event. When the exercise was finished for that day, he pulled some of our folks together into a room and he had tears in his eyes. He said, "You were doing great work. I think this is desperately needed and I appreciate what you've done." And I think that has stayed with me as one of his interest in protecting the citizens of Louisiana, his interest and passion to see it through. I think that's one of the things I do remember.
So as project manager for the Hurricane Pam exercise, I led one of the most talented IEM teams that we've ever had in designing and executing what was a first of its kind collaboration.
I was in the higher level oversight role for the project. We were trying to do in about 2 months and some change what would typically have been put together over a 9 to 12 month period for a high level exercise like this.
So my contribution to Hurricane Pam was I actually was working for the state of Louisiana at the time. I was in charge of Hurricane Pam. It was actually mine and a gentleman by the name of Mark. Him and I had gotten together and had decided that we wanted to do a hurricane exercise that had deliberate planning behind it, and it was the first time that deliberate planning had ever been done in conjunction with an exercise.
During Hurricane Pam, I was in FEMA Region 6, and I was the Response and Recovery Division Director for the region. We had the lead for putting together the scope of work for the project, working very closely with the Louisiana Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. Kind of think through in a very innovative way, a way to kind of bring together the entities, state, the local, the private sector, the federal entities, kind of work through what at the time was identified as, one of the potential top disasters of a southeast Louisiana hurricane strike.
During Hurricane Pam, I was the deputy director of the Mississippi Emergency Management Agency. And the state of Louisiana invited Mississippi and other states nearby to participate in the exercise, along with all the federal partners, because they understood that the state of Mississippi would be very important for all of evacuation and sheltering operations.
For the original Hurricane Pam exercise in the summer of 2004, I worked full-time on the team that was developing the consequence projections for the first workshop that we had.
I was able to bring some of my geography background and hazard science background to developing and designing the Hurricane Pam scenario.
Hurricane Pam was designed to bring planners and decision makers together from all levels so they could begin to grapple collectively with response issues for a catastrophic event and start the process of reviewing and reconciling their existing emergency plans.
Aspects of the plan that is most critical for saving lives, in my opinion, was the trust factor that a lot of locals got to have with the state and with the federal government through the planning process.
The publicity from that exercise was a wake-up call for everybody in New Orleans and southeastern Louisiana about what could happen if a hurricane of that magnitude hit them. And they heeded the evacuation warnings, and that alone saved many lives.
People were pulling the Pam documentations off the shelf when the storm approached. People were asking for copies of it all, during the first few weeks of that response. In reality, for Katrina, the city and state leadership issued what was actually the first ever mandatory evacuation of New Orleans. Contraflow ran for over 24 hours, and ultimately the estimates were that more than 80% of the public actually moved, likely up to 90% before landfall. So that's about 1.2 million people that left the region. It was really a fraction of the catastrophic outcome that we were planning to prevent as part of the design of the Pam exercise. So to me, the gap between those numbers is the real story.
A lot of the fact that there weren't that many deaths to the fact that so many people heeded the evacuation orders when they were given in Katrina. And I think a lot of the reason for that was the publicity that got put out there from the work that we did building the Hurricane Pam scenario.
A Hurricane Pam exercise, I was currently an FCO in another state, but I had been FCO in Louisiana a couple of years before, and my friend Colonel Mike Brown, not to be confused with, he was the state director at the time, and we chatted about it. And I know they were very concerned about the evacuation routes from the southern parishes through Nolens and the heavily populated area. And I think out of that, Mike told me that, they've made some planning where they would do that sequentially to not ball up the limited highways.
I actually think the interaction that developed between surrounding states, all of the agencies in Louisiana, and certainly all the federal partners, I think that interaction and the fact that we got to know one another before, obviously, Hurricane Katrina happened, we got to understand the challenges that Louisiana and specifically the city of New Orleans and parishes are facing. I think it made a huge amount of difference, and I think it facilitated the response and follow-on recovery.
I think just bringing together those individuals, building that relationship. So when Katrina happened, people weren't meeting for the first time. I think that was probably one of the most significant things that we did during the Hurricane Pam exercise.
One of the beautiful things about Hurricane Pam is it brought together operational specialists. But I think about all of the things that could have happened or that could have gone worse had we not done those things, and how many more lives would have been lost if the coordination in those discussions hadn't been done. And those are the things that are not measurable. Anytime lives are lost, you don't see a success, right? But but I think about how much worse it could have been. And I carry that with me to this day.
The vital role of Hurricane Pam's findings and recommendations, although they were not yet finalized at that time, in informing the response of government authorities to Hurricane Katrina. The usefulness of Hurricane Pam owed in no small measure to the striking similarity between the assumptions about the characteristics of the fictional Pam and the actual characteristics of Katrina.
There are a number of things that Hurricane Pam provided that helped the survivors of Hurricane Katrina. For example, there's a concept of a lily pad, which is having people come to a temporary destination which is safer than they are in, and then they are moved to a much safer location as subsequent action. There was a watering and de-watering of New Orleans as part of Hurricane Pam. That was an important concept. But after 20 years and the hindsight that it's provided, I would say that the biggest contribution that Hurricane Pam made was to reduce the total death toll from Hurricane Katrina. We were cited as having done work that was a scientific bullseye in predicting what the consequences would be of a storm hitting New Orleans. In fact, some of the people said it was prescient and a scientific bullseye in terms of what we predicted and what actually happened. One of the only things that we predicted that did not come to pass, and fortunately did not come to pass, is the enormous loss of life that we thought would be created by such a storm. We predicted that there would be over 60,000 deaths because the evacuation rate was expected to be what the evacuation rate has normally been for major disasters in the New Orleans area, which is in the 20% range. But because of the massive destruction simulated in Hurricane Pam, the state of Louisiana made enormous efforts to put in place a program to do reverse flow on the evacuation routes, which almost doubled the capacity of the evacuation routes. And even though the city of New Orleans was somewhat late in ordering an evacuation, a mandatory evacuation was eventually ordered on August 28th on a Sunday. And I think that those actions resulted in saving over 57,000 lives. And I think that was the enormous contribution that Hurricane Pam made to what happened in Hurricane Katrina.
The medical surge and the sheltering. There was a concept that was introduced during Pam of a temporary medical operational staging area, or it was referred to as a TMOSA. That concept provided some organized triage, stabilization, and some onward movement when the hospitals were compromised. And at the same time, pre-planned sheltering with the Red Cross and other parish partners at Pam did ultimately, in my opinion, reduce a lot of the secondary injuries or fatalities that could have occurred because those safe spaces were open early.
I think the significance was it identified certain shortfalls that were significant in terms of the scenario being one we all cringed for decades, that New Orleans would be struck.
I had served 29 years in the Army and the Army National Guard, and I'd participated in numerous exercises in the military. And one thing that we realized in the military is that exercises serve a number of purposes, but two primary purposes. One is to help develop plans for whatever that incident might be. And the second one is to try to determine what the flaws might be. I really felt like that it was a great exercise in the fact that it was able to develop all of the scenarios. I mean, it was a very extensive process, and it allowed us to war game as to how we might try to overcome the obstacles that occurred. All of those things, I think, really made a significant difference for us as we went into the Hurricane Katrina response.
I think some of the contraflow and some of the evacuation pieces that worked, I think were really a credit to some of the detail that went into and were identified during Hurricane Pam.
The relationship building, the opportunity for relationship building between the local, the state, and the federal level responders, so that when Hurricane Katrina actually did happen, those relationships were already there and were a lot stronger.
There is value in doing a scenario-based plan such as Hurricane Pam, where you look at a specific scenario and you look at the specific challenges that it poses for the citizens and the infrastructure and communities involved in that, and to try to build a response and initial recovery that is sensitive to those specific concerns.
Your exercise, your training is not a one and done. You've got to invest in that, and that investment will pay huge dividends. Once again, I really applaud Colonel Mike Brown for his vision to be able to come together and kind of really understand that they had some gaps in their planning process, and using the Pam event kind of helped to do that. I think that planning process is extremely invaluable, but it's something you've got to continually invest in, and also the training and exercising. And then when you identify through those exercises where those gaps are in your plans, that cycle starts all over again to kind of work those fixes and move forward.
I think the thing that was most important about Hurricane Pam is how great it was to really set up the conditions that we faced, a year or so later.
Scenario-based multi-agency planning should be a routine thing. It shouldn't be an episodic thing. Disasters are the wrong time to meet your partners for the first time.
Regardless of where you live in the country, whether your threat is wildfires, floods, earthquakes, every municipality and state should look at the worst case scenario and annually have a similar exercise to stretch your staff ability to deal with the worst case scenario. 80% of New Orleans actually evacuated. And I think that 80% had much to do with the work that I had done on Hurricane Pam the year before, when to start the counterflow and when to start the evacuation.
I got to know the team at IEM during Pam, and then have worked with them over the years before I retired. I really want to emphasize what a well-designed exercise that was. I know it was partially IEM, it was partially the Louisiana Emergency Management that developed that exercise, but it really was something that tried to address all of the potential shortfalls, tried to bring forth the scenarios that we would have to face in a real-world event.
A few weeks after Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, the police cordon was gone and the people had been evacuated to, I believe, 40 different states. In some cases, I drove down from Baton Rouge to New Orleans and entered this zone that was a gray zone. Everything around you looked gray and different. It looked like a black and white movie. And the power of the storm was so immense. And I remember thinking, how powerful are our models and our will as human beings to face something this destructive? Nature has a power that we don't really comprehend until we come face to face with it. And it makes us even more determined to do the best we can, to put the best science forward, to put the best data information forward, to make the best of plans so that we can save as many lives as possible and make sure that the community is able to recover as quickly and resiliently as possible. There are a number of people to thank for the work that was done in Hurricane Pam. Of course, the IEM team led by Brad Tiffey. But there was also people in other organizations and in other places, in other positions that are responsible for the work that was done. Eric Tolbert, who was the Emergency Management Director for the state of North Carolina, came to work for FEMA, and it was his vision that there should be catastrophic planning for the United States. There was no funding for it, and he pieced together funds from different places to eke out enough of a budget to be able to do this work. Colonel Mike Brown, who was the Emergency Management Director for the state of Louisiana, was an equal partner to him in this endeavor. Governor Kathleen Blanco, who was the governor of the state of Louisiana when the Hurricane Pam exercise was done, and she was the impetus for having the reverse contraflow effort put in place that saves thousands and thousands of lives. 1,700 people perished in Hurricane Katrina. Thousands more could have died if not for the actions of those people. They contributed mightily to what happened in Hurricane Katrina and making sure that the loss of life, although monumental, was not of an order of magnitude that we haven't seen in the United States in centuries.